Queen's University to you and to speak to her about her new book, Rebellious Wives, Neglectful Husbands, Controversies in Modern Qur'anic Commentary from Oxford University Press. As I was preparing for this conversation, I was reminded of the first time I met Hadia. I had heard about her, of course. I'd heard of her publications, her work in the public sphere, and how she was the first female president of the National MSA. I first saw her in a class we took together with Dr. Judith Tucker at Georgetown. And during that class, Hadia had to excuse herself so she could go express milk for her second born. I bring this up because amongst some of her most admirable achievements is that she completed her PhD whilst also having a family of 2 precious children. It is these children, and really through them, the next generation that she dedicates her book to. What I would like to do today is roughly follow the following format. I will start with speaking about what is, in my view, the most significant contribution of Hadia's book. I will allow her to speak on the same as my last question to her, so you can hear from her too, what she was trying to achieve through this book. Next, I will ask her several questions about the 4 verses she has studied closely in her book, which cover marital discourse, polygyny, and divorce. Finally, I'll open it up to questions from the audience. Please make sure you write the questions in the Q&A chat box, and we'll try to get to as many as time allows. So, one of the most significant contributions of Hadia's book is to the field of Quranic studies. Her book, both in method and content, is a challenge to the dominant mode of analysis of Quranic studies in Western academia. Western academia did not take both Muslim scholarship, produced, and especially, I underline this, methods of producing knowledge seriously. Another way to put it would be that Western academia is to a large degree divisive to Muslim modes of knowing, being, and knowledge to the point of epistemological violence. Hadia's work is groundbreaking because of its methodology, and her book will undoubtedly have an impact on the scholarship of tafsir and gender studies. If the audience wants to read on this subject, I would recommend a recent open access article by Dr. Joseph Lombard titled Decolonizing Quranic Studies, and an article by Dr. Rahil Fishbach titled Politics of Scripture. Hadia's second contribution is to the field of gender studies. Her book helps us get past the idea that historical Muslim scholarship, whether tafsir, fiqh, or any other field, is some brutish monolith. Most importantly, reading misogyny back into the historical corpus is anachronistic, or in plain speak, wrong, because the attitudes of gender justice and fairness we hold close to our hearts just did not exist in a culture that had not yet developed our values and our sensibilities. My takeaway point is that no particular historical culture was somehow progressive, including us. Rather, historical cultures were different from each other and from us, and all of us then and now are trying to do our best. All works are just approximations of attempts at understanding the Quran. We take our ideas for justice for granted, which colors everything we read. Finally, there is a tendency to elide tafsir or exegesis with the Quran itself, what the Quran itself says, to which I see Hadia's book as a corrective. Her final contribution is to the Muslim community. Hadia sat facing these verses in the Quran that many, many Muslims find difficult spiritually and do not know how to process, where to go for help, where to go to help them understand why such and such is the case, and what are they to do with the spiritual crisis that they are experiencing, especially if they're not readers of Arabic. Her book is a one-stop repository for Muslims searching and struggling to find some solace and a deeper understanding of some of the difficult verses in the Quran. And we all thank you, Hadia, for doing this difficult but necessary work. So this was my quick summary of what I think are Hadia's contributions from this book. I am going to jump directly into the chapters of the book. I'll start with chapter 2. I'll skip 1 and 3, and if we have time, I'll come back to chapter 1 and 3. But Hadia, so going to let me just show the audience your book. Beautiful. In chapter 2 of the book, titled Deflecting the Colonial Gaze, you talk about the influence of colonialism on religious discourse. Could you tell us how do political developments like colonialism and nationalism impact religious scholars' discourse on women and gender in Islam?
Yeah, well, first, thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm really excited to hear your feedback, to hear your questions. And I'm really excited that Triple IT is able to, tap into an international audience. I don't want my work to speak simply to, the Western world, but to also speak to the Muslim world, and because of my positionality as a Muslim American, for those of us who belong to both parts of the world, I think we have a unique, ability to sort of bridge both, the West and East, if you will, right? And to sort of, I think in many ways, collapse or disrupt this binary of Eastern and Western as being these two rigidly separate entities, whereas, historically, there's always been this very healthy intellectual exchange between the Muslim world and what we call, the West. These were sort of some questions I had to come to terms with, like, who am I speaking to? Who's my primary audience? And so thank you to the International Institute of Islamic Thought for hosting this, and thank you to Sawat Parvis for her work in organizing this, and to, of course, the President, Dr. Hisham Al-Talib, and Vice President Dr. Ahmed Alwani, and thank you to Dr. Roshan Iqbal, of course, for moderating. So given that, I do want to get straight into Roshan's question, which is basically, I think it's important for us to recognize that Qur'anic commentaries are dialectic. They're engaging with their intellectual context. They're also engaging with their political context. And there's a lot going on historically in the early 20th century, really late 19th, if we're thinking about Muhammad Abdo and then Rashid Rida, so late 19th, early 20th century, and then up to the mid 20th century when we have Sayyid Qutb and later Muhammad ibn Ashur writing their works. And I try to situate their commentaries, their Quranic commentaries, within these historical contexts. When we do this, we begin to see the ways in which they are responding to critical issues happening in their societies, in their communities, in the broader global Muslim community, the Ummah, if you will, and specifically on the question of women and gender in Islam. When we compare medieval and modern commentaries on verses related to women and gender in the world, we truly begin to see how, in many ways, modernity creates and incites this epistemological crisis, if you will, in many ways, but also in terms of creating a need to respond to the colonial charges, and not just colonialists, but of course, as I talk about in this chapter, the discourse established by the colonial presence, especially in North Africa, was then replicated in many ways. It was replicated by Christian missionaries, by well-meaning Western feminists, but also by indigenous secular intellectuals who in many ways internalized this presumed backwardness of Muslim civilization, and the West became the model for reform. We see this as well in terms of the different strands of Arab feminism that emerges in the early 20th century. Layla Ahmed obviously speaks about this in her book, and she talks about how the dominant strand of feminism was the one that valorized the West. And there have been many, obviously, critiques of, to be fair, not just critiques, but also assessments of Huda Sha'rawi's work. But one thing I found really interesting, and I believe it was Margot Badran who speaks about this, that why does, in her personal memoir, one of the most important Arab feminists in Arab history is Huda Sha'rawi, why does she go out of her way to really accentuate and amplify her connection to France and her connection to the French? And she had a French mentor. So my point in all of this is to kind of take into consideration how these discourses impact these scholars. One thing I do say in this chapter is that they're not simply responding. Okay, so we do have, in some cases, like with Rashid Rida and Sayyid Qutb, I believe that they are very much responding to a certain contemporaneous discourse. So for Rashid Rida, he's very much responding to Western critics of Islam in terms of Islam's treatment of women. Sayyid Qutb is very much responding to indigenous, Arab intellectuals who have sort of, if you will, left Islam, and there's a lot there in terms of his ideology, the ideology of Islamism that he adopts towards the latter part of his life. And I stress that because it's important to see these commentators as individuals and to think about their own intellectual trajectories and how that influences the way they engage with the Quran. And there's a lot to say about Sayyid Qutb in particular because of obviously, you know, the space he occupies in our literary imagination in the West. And I argue that we need to find the historical figure of Qutb, not just the one that exists in our literary imaginations, right? And a lot of it is sort of retroactive associations, you know, after 9/11 and whatnot. So with that, so my second point, Roshan, is that they're not simply responding. I also find that they are in some ways trying to speak to Muslims and say like, hey, you know, we haven't always done our part, you know, when it comes to polygyny, even though Sayyid Qutb and Rashid Rida in particular, their tafsir on this verse for very specific historical reasons, and the sort of discourses that emerge at this time seem very defensive and almost polemical. At the same time, they say, listen, you know, Muslims, we have not applied this verse correctly. You know, so even with these defensive posturing, you find this sort of acknowledgement that we've abused this license. This is not the way it was meant to be applied. Similarly with Muhammad Abdo and Ibn Ashur, I think with the two of them in specific, because of their scholarly background, you find that they're often speaking to fellow scholars. And with Ibn Ashur in specific, I argue that he is engaging mainly with the tradition itself. He's very much invested in renewing the methodologies of the classical tradition, and therefore he's actually speaking directly to this tradition, to those who are familiar with this tradition, and offering a corrective in many ways. So ironically, although he's reviving its methods and trying to maintain or retain a relevance for this tradition in light of colonialism, in light of secularism, in light of the rise of Salafism as well, you know, he's trying to kind of retain this position for the classical, you know, tafsir bil-ra'i, philological tradition, but he's also opining new meanings and very much critiquing certain aspects of the tradition when it comes to women and gender.
Yeah, I mean, when I was reading your chapter, I was thinking like, you know, when you read things like this over and over again, you realize that, of course, people were speaking from their context, but it's so hard for people to understand that any work is a product of its context and is deeply human. So thank you so much for that explanation, but let me just jump into the more difficult portions. So the next two chapters speak of the mention of Nashu's marital conflict in the Quran. You start your discussion on marital conflict not with the verse 434, which is how it's usually done, rather with the verse 4128. Could you tell us why? And I do think that just this framing, having the reader reckon with verse 4128 before 434, is one of your other methodological contributions. I would like you to start by giving us a translation of this verse, and then if you could share with us the findings of this chapter.
Yes, thanks so much, Roshan, for bringing this up, and I will share the translation in a moment. I do want to point out, exactly as you said, there's been this disproportionate emphasis on Qur'anic verses that appear to privilege men at the expense of countless other verses that establish, you know, female rights or promote egalitarianism. I recently just finished a chapter looking at verse 4:4, you know, on this notion of the recognizing the value of women and providing a meher, providing a marital dower, if you will, and the fact that exegetes, you know, commentaries on this was very much free of notions that this was sort of some sort of exchange for a woman's, you know, body or some sort of sexual rights. It was remarkably free of that, at least in the exegetical literature. And so there is a responsibility, I feel, for scholars engaging in this work. And I know we have, I think, some of those scholars online today who are doing this work. And I do want to note there's a plethora of voices who are engaging with the Quran's gender ethics. And I think it's really important for us to, you know, I guess the question becomes like, why are we so fixated on a few verses? You know, why are we so fixated on verse 434? And I'm not in any way, because I am also like responsible. I'm also part of that, right? Like two of my pieces have dealt particularly with 434. So, I mean, so I'm not trivializing our concern. I mean, there are good reasons for that, but at the same time, let's look at the verse dealing with the nushuz of men. Because interestingly, and for those who believe in the divine ontology of the Quran, God is using here the same word to describe a certain state of which husbands are sometimes guilty and a certain state of which wives are sometimes guilty. And so, let me see if I can share this verse with you. Okay, so this is first. I will show the verse in Arabic. I'm gonna enlarge it here. So this is the verse in Arabic, and Roshan, you can see this on your screen.
Yes, I can.
Okay, so in Arabic, وإن امرأة خافت من بعلها نشوزا أو إعراضا فلا جناح عليهما أن يصلحا بينهما صلحا والصلح خير وأحضرت الأنفس الشح وإن تحسنوا وتتقوا فإن الله كان بما تعملون خبيرا. So this is first the verse in Arabic, and I will read the translation. And if a woman has reason to fear nushuz from her husband or desertion, so I don't translate it here, we'll look at why. There's no blame on them if they arrange an amicable settlement between themselves, and settlement or reconciliation is best, even though men's souls are swayed by greed. But if you do good and practice self-restraint, God is well acquainted with all that you do. So there are a couple of questions that arise. First of all, what I find interesting is when it comes to both verse 434 and 4128, in which they're describing a nushuz from one of the two spouses, right? So 434, it's a nushuz of women. 4128, it's a nushuz of men. In both cases, you don't have a word that's basically saying a nashes or a nawashes. It's kind of creating a distance between the subject and between the action. So wallati takhafuna nushuzahunna for women, for those women from whom you fear nushuz, right? It's creating the separation, like maybe they're committing it, maybe they're not. Similarly, وإن امرأة خافت من بعلها نشوزا, for if a woman fears from her husband nushuz, again creating separation. It's not saying that Nash's husband or that Nash's wife, right?
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting because you see this sort of the framing itself, not just the word, but the framing is very much remarkably and strikingly parallel in terms of the fact that maybe there's a perception, right? One of the two parties has this perception that my wife is committing nushuz, and the husband, and in the other case, the wife is suspects her husband of committing nushuz. And so what is this word? What I find really interesting in my work, which for those of you who are have started to read it, and I would love to hear your comments, is that pre-modern exegetes, even when they noted that this word is coming from one semantic wellspring, al-irtifa, they said, or isti'la, this kind of rising or elevation, they proceeded to interpret this word in very gendered ways. And for women, it was primarily, disobedience, defiance. Primarily, for some of them, like At-Tabari, it was, refusal to respond to her husband's sexual needs, if you will. And then for the women, there was no notion of a husband being disobedient to his wife. Rather, it was that he was sort of not really interested in his wife. And it was interesting to me because they spent a lot of time looking at why. Like, why is he no longer interested in her? And they thought, oh, maybe she's overweight now. They've been married for a long time. She's had all these children. Maybe she's no longer attractive. Maybe there's this other woman who's caught his attention. And so what do you do? So there was this presumption that he's not interested in her and he's not treating her well. He's not upholding her right to good companionship based on their understanding of another verse 419, وَعَاشِرُوهُنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, live with women kindly. Bil-ma'ruf could be translated in so many ways, kindly according to honorable norms. But they did believe that not every marriage was worthy of saving. Nonetheless, they proceeded to interpret this settlement here as mainly that the wife now, since the husband's not interested in her, that she should sort of waive some of her rights. But it's like, wait a second, he's the one who's committing the shoes. Why should she forego some of her rights, And they said, well, She could forego some of her financial rights. She could forego her allotment of nights, what they called haq al-mabit, the right that he stay a certain portion, number of nights with her, or al-qasam they called it. So they said, she should forego something. There were few reports in At-Tabari's tafsir who noted maybe he should waive some of his rights in order to settle, or that they should both waive some of their rights. But for the most part, you find this kind of putting the responsibility on the wife. And what I point out is, again, in all of these chapters, specifically chapters 4 through 7, I'm comparing what changes when we compare modern exegetes. And the most interesting modern mufassir I found in regards to 4128 was Ibn Ashur, who first of all says, no, the word nushuz here is not gendered, it's hatred of the other. And it applies equally to men and women. So it's in many, I see it as sort of like reviving the literal Qur'anic usage, because it can't be a coincidence that the same word is being used to describe a state in which husbands sometimes might be guilty, and a state of which a state in which you can find both men and women. So the second thing he says is he proceeds to interpret sulh here, the settlement. What should the settlement look like? As a woman's dignified exit out of a marriage. And it was very refreshing when you're looking at kind of the medieval interpretations, and for the most part, they believe the wife should be compromising. She has, if she wants to stay in this marriage, she should compromise something. By the way, I do want to point out two things. So when you look at 434, I noticed they weren't looking at like, well, why is the wife being nashisa here? And I couldn't help but think when it came to the men's nushuz, they were like, well, why is he not interested in his wife? Maybe, but I was like, well, that's interesting, because maybe if we had a female mufassira, she would have been like, why is the wife doing this, right? And interestingly, Ibn Ashur with verse 434 does acknowledge that maybe the husband's doing something that's driving his wife to commit nushuz. Maybe he's responsible. But so he was one of the few who's like, well, why is she doing this? But for the husband, there definitely was this emphasis. Second, I also wanted to point out that even though they said, the settlement here primarily was a responsibility for her to forego something to remain in this marriage, they did say, she should agree to this compromise. If she does not agree, it's not legally valid, because these are her legal rights within the marriage. But they also, just to kind of give charity, and I think it's important to give charity to our reading of medieval interpretations, we have to understand their historical context. They saw marriage as critical to protecting a woman socially and financially in ways that may not be true for women today.
Yeah.
And so we say, like, why salvage a broken marriage? He's not interested in her, whatever the reason might be. Like, why attempt to salvage this? And they felt like marriage is providing something for her in a way that we might not find to be true today. But Ibn Ashur, again, he provides legal and philological reasons for why he interprets as-sulh here as this exit, as giving her the right to exit this marriage through khulu'.
I mean, I do agree with you, obviously, that, the breakup of marriage in many, up until recently, was a type of social death. But I also sort of take a little bit of issue with scholars who sort of upheld the idea of marriage so high, but our community has not developed marital counseling or some kind of system that when you do get married, then it doesn't break up because you had some sort of consciousness raising, emotional, a development of complex language and stuff like that. But anyway, I digress. The next question I wanted to ask you was that your next chapter discusses 434. This verse is also is where the title of your book comes, Rebellious Wives. Could you first give us a translation of this verse and then give us a quick summary of the exegetical works that you looked at? Finally, could you also speak to recent Muslim feminist interpretations of this verse?
So to share my screen, I'm sorry, I have too many tabs open, so I'm going to try to share my screen.
Take your time.
And okay, bismillah. So 434. Okay, so I think most of you are very familiar with this verse. Nonetheless, I'm going to read it in Arabic and then provide a translation. الرجال قوامون على النساء بما فضل الله بعضهم على بعض وبما أنفقوا من أموالهم فالصالحات قانتات حافظات للغيب بما حفظ الله واللاتي تخافون نشوزهن فعظوهن واهجروهن في المضاجع واضربوهن فإن أطعنكم فلا تبغوا عليهن سبيلا إن الله كان عليا كبيرا. So as you can see, I have not translated two of the words here, and actually in the book I decided not to actually translate the last of the three imperatives, or what appears to be an imperative. So men are qawamun over women with what God has favored some over others, and with what they, and here the they is masculine, spend out of their wealth. Therefore righteous women are devoted and guard the unseen as God has guarded it. As for those women whose nushuz you fear, admonish them, avoid them in their beds, and then wadribuhun, right? And this is where a lot of ink has been spilt in the last few decades trying to reconcile what is being asked of people and of men in this verse, and what does this mean for the Quran gender ethics. And then it continues to say, but if they obey you, then seek nothing against them. Behold, God is most high and great. So, and of course I know we saw Dr. Farid Isaac with us, who's written a lot on verse 434, and I'm sure there are a few others we have on here who are probably familiar, and perhaps have also offered some scholarship on this verse. So first of all, in terms of, qawamun, to go into this notion of qawamun, for the most part, we find that medieval exegetes did believe it provides some sort of male privilege in the marriage, right? Because the husband is, they say providing financially, he's protecting the wife, he's doing sort of, these, and in exchange for these, these services, if you will, or benefits that he's providing to the wife, that she should obey him. That is one way you see qiwama. It is sort of this authority. What I find interesting, and in another piece, Breaking the Interpretive Monopoly, which was published a while back, over 10 years ago, I do know that this notion of qiwama gradually expands if we look at medieval exegetes. Like Al-Tabari is very much confining qiwama to his legal rights. Like it's not this open-ended obedience, like he says jump and she asks how high, that is not the way that, I find medieval that's not how I find medieval early medieval interpretations. It was very much embedded in his legal rights, like, and mainly here they're referring to his sexual rights, that she not refuse him in bed. And there's that's a whole separate topic. Keisha Ali has written a lot about this and sexual ethics in Islam, and in her other book on marriage, money, and marriage and money in Islam, right? Is that right? Roshan, it's called Marriage,
Maybe.
Marriage, Money, and Slavery, I believe.
Yeah.
So, so Qawamun, what was different when we look at modern exegetes? I found that this notion of obedience was strikingly absent. They didn't really talk about any right of obedience for the husband. It does kind of come back when they talk about nushuz, but it was an interesting, there was this interesting difference. And also, of course, and I talk about this throughout the book, is the new framing of these verses that modern exegetes bring forth. This idea, and it's very clearly embedded in their historical context, that they are trying to salvage the Quran from accusations that it is misogynist, and we have to understand, where is this coming from? And if you read chapter 2 of the book, Deflecting the Colonial Gaze, I talk about this sort of what Spivak calls, well, I don't think she calls it the colonial obsession, but I call it the colonial fixation with, what she says, saving brown women from brown men, right? And so there is this discourse going on, which they are very much responding to and living that reality in a much more pronounced way than we are now further down in now in the 21st century. And so just two more things I guess I will note about verse 434 is Aisha Chowdhury has written one of the most comprehensive works, I would say, on this verse, on domestic violence, or in her work, Domestic Violence and Islam. I kind of come away with a different reading of the medieval tradition. And my reading is that I believe the Qur'anic commentators, even in the medieval period, did not proffer a straightforward interpretation of this verse. I felt that they very much kind of, you can see this struggle with, conscientious struggle, you can say, right? And they restricted this verse. So even the most traditional interpretations, for the most part, offered some sort of restriction. And for this last imperative, وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, they argued that it was a symbolic, right? And I think there are many of us here that would say, well, from our vantage point, that's still problematic. Like even the symbolic hitting with a handkerchief or whatnot, because of what that implies. This sort of authority you have over someone else or over someone's bodies. And I want to point out that I think it is absolutely critical for us, especially in this heightened age of Islamophobia, to really distinguish between text and praxis. And I think it is faulty on so many levels to try to blame the Quran for the way Muslims behave or they don't behave. If Muslims, and it's really easy for us to blame human behavior on text, but I think that's problematic for so many reasons. And so when it comes to praxis, I think one of the really important works that's been written on this is Juliana Hammer's book on peaceful families, that the title itself stems from a project in Herndon, Virginia, actually right across the street from where Triple IT is housed, a project on really trying to stem out religious, domestic violence from Muslim households. And so I think we need to, when we engage, I'm engaging in text and I'm engaging in interpretation of text, I think we have to be careful not to jump to the conclusion that human behavior is somehow connected to text and interpretation of text, because psychologists and sociologists can tell us that there are many complex psychological factors for why human beings abuse one another. And I so with that caveat said, I will mention that my reading of the medieval tradition is that there was this one can say maybe discomfort with what does وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ actually mean. There was a sort of attempt to procedurally restrict how it's applied in several ways. Some of them saying, well, nushuz has to be actually confirmed. You can't just assume you can't just suspect that she's that she's nashiza. They also said there should be some sort of procedural sequence, right? You can't apply all three steps simultaneously. And the third is that this is really غير مبرح, non-injurious, which they took specifically from a prophetic tradition. Nonetheless, even in the medieval tradition, I try to amplify the voices of outliers, of people like Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi in the early 12th century, I believe his early 12th century, if I'm not mistaken. People like Fakhruddin al-Razi, early 13th century, and even Ibn Ashur in the 20th century, who clearly are uncomfortable and say a man should never hit his wife, regardless of the reason. Ibn Ashur, his interpretation is quite interesting because he has a linguistic analysis that I have not seen any previous exegete offer, which is that perhaps this verse, and he says perhaps this verse is actually not even addressing the husbands, except with the second step, وَهَجِرُوهُنَّ فِي الْمَضَاجِعِ, because only the husbands can sexually abstain from their wives. But he says, when it says وَاللَّاتِ تَخَافُونَ نُشُوزَهُنَّ, for those whose nushuz you fear, who is this you here? Who's being spoken to? And he says that perhaps these are the legal authorities, because nushuz is something serious. It's not this, and he says it's not just getting mad at one another, because he said this is absolutely a natural thing for men and women to be mad at each other, husbands and wives to get mad at one another. So he said it's something that's far more serious, and that perhaps should be elevated to a court for a court to decide whether or not nushuz has actually taken place. And then accordingly, and he provides both, linguistic and legal reasons for that interpretation. He says that accordingly, it's not the husbands who should do the hitting. And now some would say maybe he's sanctioning state violence here. I think what he's really trying to do is take away this third step from the authorities of husbands. And he says hitting is a very dangerous matter. And if you allow husbands to hit their wives while they're angry, they will absolutely transgress. They're going to vent their anger. And he, as a jurist and as a mufti, he's very much aware and attuned to the fact that this could become a loophole for potential abuse. And I believe the way I read his interpretation is he's trying to stem this by saying, this verse is perhaps addressing legal authorities, not husbands at all.
Mm-hmm. I agree with you that, texts are, especially the Quran, is not the only reason why domestic violence exists in Muslim communities. But I also think that, the Quran does have a special valence. And so the existence of this verse is problematic. And so I'd like to push back a little bit here and say that even when we consider the intertextual analysis of verse 3:4 with verse 4:128, as you have done, it does not address the fact that the Quran outlines different treatments for men and women, right? And from the standpoint of a literal reading of this verse, men receive preferential treatment. And the consequences for men and women, as Dr. Keisha Ali has pointed out, and I quote, do not merely differ in the interpretation of the exegetes, whether it be Ibn Ashur or anyone else, but are clearly differentiated in the text of the Quran itself. So Hadi, how would you respond to this critique? Because I think this is the question that many Muslims have, that we struggle with. And not to say that you will solve all our problems, but,
Yeah, I think clearly this is an ongoing debate that Muslim scholars have been having among one another. You have on one end of the spectrum, Asma Barlas, Aziz al-Hibri, Maysam al-Faruqi, a few other more recent voices as well. And of course, Amina Wadud, especially if we were to consider her first work on women in the Quran, which I think was an excellent work, or is an excellent piece of scholarship. I think, so on one spectrum, we have women who are, providing egalitarian readings of the Quran. There's a new one that came out by Abul Hassan. I still haven't read it, although I just purchased my copy. Esma Lambaber, I think, if I'm not mispronouncing her last name, a Moroccan scholar. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have, scholars like Keisha Ali, Aisha Hidayatullah, Ibrahim Musa, and others who, argue that perhaps these egalitarian readings are also a projection of, feminist sensibilities upon the Quran in a way that's anachronistic, in a way that's not really being truthful to the literal meaning of the text. So my position is I am personally uncomfortable when we start using language like literal meaning of the text, because the Quran is not meant to be taken literally. In the sense, and I have to, I think the Quran is, whether we're looking at the way Muslims historically approached it or the way Muslims approach it today, I think the Quran is recognized as, because the divine ontology of the Quran is always seen to open up the possibilities of meaning rather than restrict the possibilities of meaning. And as those of you who are familiar with Islam, that Muslims believe, the one thing I can say all the sects agree with is that the Quran is the word of God. And if it's the word of God, there is no human being, whether now or in the past, who can say this is definitively the meaning of this verse, and that's the end. We're going to close the doors of tafsir, right? And all you people out there, stop doing tafsir of this verse, because this is it. We found the definitive meaning.
Figured it out, yeah.
It's like you don't find that position among anyone, whether in the history of this genre. It was always this humility and this recognition that, we are going to derive masail, these kind of questions, like what could this mean? And what I find remarkable and what I want to revive is this pluralism, this inherent pluralism of this tradition that I think we've lost sight of. And I think also I would sort of blame our scholarship. Western scholarship has sort of portrayed this genre, the literary genre of Quranic commentaries as just, consistently and monolithically patriarchal, as just, that it paints the image, regardless of the words being used. I think it paints the image in the minds of readers and young scholars out there that this is this very kind of monolithic, rigid, what do I want to say, like hermetically sealed genre, which is not the case. We find evolution, we find developments, we find scholars who are taken seriously, like At-Tabari, but then who, on a specific interpretation, all the succeeding exegetes said, nope, he was wrong on this, he was wrong on this, like his, for example, interpretation of Wahjiruhunna, right? Everyone, and Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi has some really strong words of rebuke for At-Tabari, saying, like, don't talk about something that you don't have, that you're not qualified. I can't remember the exact words he used, but, very strong words of critique. Yet, At-Tabari is still seen as a heavyweight, if you will, in this genre. And so there was this recognition that scholars are human beings. They're doing their best ability to derive meaning from divine words, from divine discourse, if you will. And to come back to your question, I think I find it to be sort of ironically cyclical when a scholar says, okay, this feminist interpretation or egalitarian interpretation that Barlas is offering, or Wadud, is a projection on the text, and it's not really inherent to the text. But these patriarchal readings or androcentric readings are inherent to the text. It's like, wait, how do you know what's inherent to the text? It's sort of eliminating the role of the reader and what we derive. And I think we have to be honest that we are all reading the Quran from our own positionalities. We bring to the Quran our backgrounds, our training, our experiences, and our worldviews and what we believe. Mm-hmm. And when if we believe that God is inherently just, then that will obviously clearly influence the way we read these verses. And if we are unable to come to an interpretation that completely aligns with that, then we say maybe we're missing something. That's the way I would personally say. I mean, maybe I'm missing something, because my knowledge is limited. My understanding of this is limited. But whatever it is saying, it's not giving men authority over women or privilege over women in my own interpretation of it.
I mean, of course, many Muslim feminists have written on it, and you don't have to be a woman to be a Muslim feminist. I personally love the work of Laurie Silvers. In her article in this book, We Have Left Nothing Out, and what she says that basically, if I remember correctly, and the summary is that what is legal is not necessarily moral, is not necessarily ethical. And so that we need to somehow separate, and that God is trying to raise our moral sort of standard by putting this in there as a permissibility, but that is not to say that you should act on it. So my next question, Hadia, is that your next chapter speaks on polygyny, and it notes that modern exegetes brought forth a new rationalization for polygyny. Please tell us more about the medieval and modern interpretations of verse 433 and how they differ. And please start with giving us the translation of the verse. It's always good to see it.
Okay, so 4:3. First, I will read it in Arabic. أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم. وإن خفتم ألا تقسطوا في اليتامى فانكحوا ما طاب لكم من النساء مثنى وثلاث ورباع فإن خفتم ألا تعدلوا فواحدة أو ما ملكت أيمانكم ذلك أدنى ألا تعودوا. And forgive the typo here with أيمانكم. It's sort of I have trouble copying and pasting. So if you fear that you will not deal fairly with orphan girls, then you may marry other women made lawful to you, even 2, 3, or 4. If you fear that you cannot be equitable or just to them, then marry only one or your enslaved female. This way you are less likely to commit injustice. ذَلِكَ أَدْنَى أَلَّا تَعُولُوا, right? And so with that, I do want to point out a couple of, I think, interesting findings. One is that whereas modern exegetes were very much invested in trying to explain why polygyny exists in the Quran and why God has allowed polygyny to exist, the vantage point of medieval exegetes was, why has this been restricted and limited? Why is God limiting this pre-existing institution and limiting it to 4? I thought that was very interesting, and it's very clear to me that for medieval exegetes, they saw this as restrictive, and they're trying to explain why it's being restricted, right? But because of the changes that happened with modernity, and specifically the colonial critique of polygyny, and as well as internal Muslim critique of polygyny, you find that almost at least 3 of the 4 modern exegetes are having to respond to that reality and respond to that critique. In this verse in specific, I found Muhammad Abdo's interpretation to be most unique among the 4 modern mufassirin. And he actually, I think he's clearly influenced by his own background as a judge. And he talks about all the terrible things he's witnessed in his life that have been the byproduct of polygynous marriages. He says, I've seen fraud, I've seen theft, I've seen murder. But what I find really interesting is he actually blames this on the co-wives. He says the co-wives just incite this hatred in their children for the other family. And I'm just like, Yvonne Haddad talks about that Muhammad Abdo comes from a polygynous family, that his own father had married 2 women. And when I read that interpretation, I said to myself, I wonder to what extent this interpretation may be influenced by his own personal experience as someone who grew up in a polygynous household. And so he actually appeals to, at the end of his tafsir, he appeals to contemporaneous Hanafi jurists to repeal the laws on polygyny. And he interestingly doesn't do this by saying, this is an ancient institution or practice and it's out of sync with modernity and we need to modernize, the way many might assume as since he was an Islamic modernist. Rather, he actually comes back to the legal maxim of maslaha, of the idea that Sharia itself is there to protect the welfare of human societies. And he says we cannot ignore the fact that this practice is no longer protecting the welfare of society the way it's practiced today. And he said perhaps it did in the 7th century when Islam sort of allowed it, but you can say it was a qualified permission. And interestingly though, he ends with a strong appeal to say, listen, we need to repeal these laws because the outcome is not what the Sharia intends, is not what the verse itself intended. Nonetheless, you have Rashid Rida, who is his disciple, then affixed an 8-page fatwa to this interpretation. Of course, we know that Tafsir al-Manar was published after the death of Muhammad Abdo, who dies in 1905, and it's really his disciple that takes his teacher's notes, Muhammad Abdo, and transcribes them, and then adds his own commentary as well. And so, of course, this tafsir is co-authored. Some say, it's really Rashid Rida is the main author, of this work. Al-Fadl ibn Ashur, the son of Al-Tahir ibn Ashur, believed that really we should ascribe the work to Rashid Rida. Others say, no, it's really, I think it's clearly both of them. And one of the things I try to do in this work that I think is unique is I try to distinguish where is Abdo speaking and where is Abdo speaking and where is Rida speaking. And I think a lot of previous works, unfortunately, do not distinguish between Rida's words and Abdo's words. And I believe that Rida has much more conservative positions on women than his teacher did. And I try to highlight where their views diverge. But on polygyny, Rida seems very defensive because of this 8-page fatwa he puts to respond to French critics. So on one hand, the fatwa itself, which those of you who are familiar with the fatwa, it's a legal response. So the question itself lends itself to this sort of criticism because the question is asking, how do we respond? This medical student in America says, how do we respond to critics of polygyny? So on one hand, the question itself is asking Rida to respond to Western critics. But on the other hand, he overturns his teacher's commentary in some ways by now providing a really strong defense of the institution of polygyny. And one more, there are a few other findings, of course, that you will find when you read the chapter. I will say that medieval interpretations, there was none of this polemics going on. And there was none of this polemics because it was just simply a non-issue. Polygyny was not something that they had to sort of either defend or affirm in any way, shape, or form. And they were really mainly interested in the syntactical structure of this verse and trying to understand the connection between orphans and being just to orphans and this notion of having multiple wives. And there were several connections provided, but what I find really interesting, and I know in this chapter on polygyny, is that they found justice to be the ultimate aim of this verse. And they said, wherever you find justice, that is where you should you should follow it. Even if that means not getting married at all. I believe it was At-Tabari who says, if you can't even be just to one woman, just don't get married. And so,
that would be all, most people.
and he said, if you have a and I don't want to get into the slavery part, you can, at Tasadri, you can have a concubine or slave, if you will, but don't get married if you cannot be just even to one wife. And so it's interesting to see the very different ways that modern commentators and medieval commentators were approaching this verse.
I mean, again, centering of justice by medieval commentators notwithstanding, it is a gendered verse and it has its own problems, but I'm not going to have you comment on that. I want to move on to your next chapter, which is on the verse 228. You argue that scholars have focused less on the legal dimensions of the verse than the gendered dimensions. Why do you think it's important to focus on the legal aspect of this verse? And second, what did you find about modern interpretations of the verse that is any different from the medieval interpretations? As always, please start by giving us a translation of the verse to 228.
Yes, absolutely. So first, here I'm going to read it right off the web. The verse begins with بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والمطلقات يتربصن بأنفسهن ثلاثة قروء ولا يحل لهن أن يكتمن ما خلق الله في أرحامهن إن كن يؤمن بالله واليوم الآخر وبعولتهن أحق بردهن في ذلك إن أرادوا إصلاحا ولهن مثل الذي عليهن بالمعروف وللرجال عليهن درجة والله عزيز حكيم. So I'll just go with Khattab's translation here. Divorced women must wait 3 cycles before they can remarry. Interestingly, he's one of the few who adds this part. Actually, sorry, I take that back. I think a few others have added before they can remarry. It is not lawful for them to conceal what God has created in their wombs if they truly believe in God and the last day, and their husbands reserve the right to take them back within that period if they desire reconciliation, and this actually ends up becoming really important in medieval interpretations as well. This clause right here. Women have rights similar to those of men equitably. I translate bil ma'ruf as according to honorable norms, although men have a degree above them, and God is almighty, all-wise. Now we see here Khattab adds of responsibility, right? I will note, interestingly, Halim, in contrast, says a degree of right, right? So you have one translator, modern translator, saying a degree of right, and another one a degree of responsibility, just to kind of point out that even when we are just translating, there are these discrepancies, if you will, which are all interpretive ones. This is a legal verse, and I think this is really important to know. It's talking about the legal process that governs a husband's pronouncement of divorce, right? The next verse deals with perhaps a female-initiated divorce, especially towards the latter part of it. But this is specifically dealing with a male-initiated divorce with talaq. And of course, we know Islamic law, a different genre than exegesis, although it's still informed, commentators were still informed by law. Although these were very distinct genres with different methods and different objectives, and that's, I think, very clear and very important to establish, and I talk about this in my chapter 7, specifically on this verse. They saw this as a legal verse that's establishing the rights and responsibilities of each party during this process of divorce, which is clearly you have this waiting period Clearly, it's saying women should not conceal what's in their rooms, whether they're pregnant or they're menstruating, right? Because menstruation would be an indication of non-pregnancy for the most part. And then, men, what is their right and responsibility? It says that men have the greater right to take them back, the husband, if they desire reconciliation. And then it proceeds to say that women, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, that for women are rights like the rights against them or like their responsibilities, بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. So some exegetes actually believed that this clause here is actually speaking about this legal process of divorce. Al-Tabari, Al-Razi, Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, I believe it was Ibn al-Arabi if I'm not mistaken, who said, this is basically the responsibility for each party not to harm the other. Well, how does each party harm the other? They believed it could manifest in gendered ways. So in this specific legal context, the wife would be harming the husband by concealing what's going on biologically with her. So she could say, I'm done, I've had 3 menstrual cycles, my waiting period is done, and clearly she might actually be pregnant, right? And what's really interesting to note is that they all said her claim about her biological status is not to be second guessed, is not to be questioned, unless the women, right, the women of that community, unless they find fault with her claims. So clearly there, the testimony of other women was being leveraged or being amplified over the testimony of the man, of any man, including the husband himself. So if a wife said, my iddah is over, I've menstruated 3 times, or I've, whatever the case might be, of course, quru could be 3 menstrual cycles, or it could be 3 cycles of purity, and that's a legal distinction, but nonetheless, they said, she has her testimony over her body has greater weight over the testimony of anyone else, as long as, the women believe her, as long as they felt like it was actually biologically possible. So that's, the daraja there. That's, the legal context. How do men harm their wives if during this process? They would harm her by taking her back, by exercising haqq al-raja, by exercising the right to revoke a marriage, just to harm her, just to keep her in limbo, in a marriage in which she's not being given her rights, which is most importantly kind treatment, right? Husn al-ushra, the right to be treated like a wife in a dignified way, right? And interestingly, even medieval mufassirin, in fact, put a lot of premium on this idea of that the husband had the responsibility to provide husn al-ushra based on verse 419. And so they believed that this was gendered, like the way men and women can harm each other, but it was, for some of them, it was very much connected to this legal process of divorce. Ironically, however, when it came to this last clause, وَلِلْرِجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ, none of the medieval exegetes actually then confined it to the legal process of divorce. And it was only the modern mufassir, Sayyid Qutb, so in this case, it was Sayyid Qutb's modern interpretation that I think pushed back against the dominant interpretation of this verse. And he said, listen, this haqq al-raja is what this daraja is. The daraja here, this degree that men have, is the ability in this context to revoke the divorce, because it's a male-initiated divorce. It's not a khula, or it's not a judicial annulment, a fasakh of a marriage, in which case the husband has no right to revoke the divorce in either context. It's only in this context, right? He pronounced the divorce, so he has the right to revoke it as long as the waiting period has not expired. And he basically says she's the one waiting. The wife is the one waiting. She is basically at the mercy of his decision whether or not to resume the marriage or not in this context, because of course, if he exercises his right, theoretically, of haqq al-raja, she then can say, okay, well, I want to initiate khula. I want to initiate divorce, and that would be a different process. But verse 228 of chapter 2 is speaking about a very specific legal process. And Qutb argues that medieval mufassirin took this idea of daraja, of men's degree, and applied it in ways and interpreted it in ways that did not befit the meaning of the verse, by saying men are inherently superior to women, or men have some sort of privilege over women. Rather, it's confined to this legal process. In this very specific situation, he has the upper hand because he can revoke the divorce, and she's basically waiting. And I find that so interesting because although you have some medieval commentators who said the previous clause, وَلَهُنَّ مِثْلُ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِنَّ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ, that women have rights like the rights against them, it's connected to the legal process. They did not say the same, with the men's degree part, with the clause on men's degree, which seems methodologically inconsistent, if you will, right? And so I think this was an important interpretation to kind of summon. I also want to point out that we have in the medieval period people like Mufassirin, like At-Tabari, who did not interpret men's degree as a degree of privilege, but rather, as we saw with Al-Khattab's translation, as a degree of responsibility. And he based this interpretation on the statement of the Prophet's own cousin, Abdullah ibn al-Abbas, who basically says this means that a husband should waive or pardon his wife from some of her responsibilities while continuing to fulfill all of her rights. And it's because of this, like almost he prefers, this leniency towards the wife, this being magnanimous, if you will, so.
I do remember reading that, and it almost brought tears to my eyes, really. It was kind of really beautiful. So Hadia, we are at, the time is 1:02. I had 3 more questions for you, but I don't think that we can get to all 3 questions because we have some questions from the audience. I was going to give you a choice to answer 1 more question. So my next question was going to be, if you were a mufassira, how would you be like, sort of give us an exegesis of these verses, and then your discussion on Aisha Hidayatullah's book, Feminist Edges in the Quran, and the conclusion. Did you want to speak about that? And I did promise the audience that in the end, you would get to say what the contributions of your book are, but maybe, the first 2 questions, one of them you can choose, depending on which you feel like answering right now.
Yeah, okay, so that's a difficult choice, Roshan, but I will say, I will say, maybe I'll address the second question because I believe it's important to engage with the classical tafsir tradition. I think a lot of Muslim readers in particular have a certain idea of what the tradition says without actually substantively engaging with the tradition. And again, we are also guilty of reading the tradition in monolithic ways. Like maybe they've been exposed to Tafsir Ibn Kathir, which, by the way, although it has its merits, also has a lot of misogyny, in my opinion. Like with وَلِلرِّجَالِ عَلَيْهِنَّ دَرَجَةٌ, which we just discussed, it's very much embedded in an interpretation that reinforces male privilege, even to the extent that he says al-fadl fi dunya wal akhirah, this preference that men have in this dunya and in this life and in the next. And so obviously, clearly that interpretation is contradicted by several verses of the Quran that talks, about the spiritual equality of men and women, verses that Amina Wadud and Asma Barlas and others have talked a lot about. Nonetheless, so we have Muslim readers who are growing up perhaps being exposed to 1 or 2 tafsir because that is the interpretation that was used in their study circle at the mosque. That is perhaps the translation that's been translated into English, or the commentary that was translated into English. Maybe perhaps it's the most accessible, right? A lot of these exegeses with which I'm engaging are not translated into English. Some of them are not really very much accessible. Well, today they're obviously clearly digitally accessible if you're reading them in Arabic. And so I want us to engage with this tradition because I believe if we remove our critical visors, we can find, like the Tabari's interpretation, right? We can find interpretations that really push back against dominant ones that are maybe overwhelmingly patriarchal, not monolithically patriarchal, but overwhelmingly patriarchal. And as a Muslim woman, I'm invested in both my religion. I'm also invested in, gender justice, and I do not believe that these are mutually exclusive pursuits. In fact, I find them very much not just aligned. I think the very aim of Islam is justice in all its forms, whether it's political justice or gender justice or justice to the environment, justice to animals, right? And so I'm very much invested in engaging with this tradition so that we can, find ways to engage with this tradition in meaningful ways as Muslims rather than just discarding the baby with the bathwater, if you will. And I think it really creates a space for moving beyond the impasse that Aisha Hidayatullah describes in her book.
Thank you so much, Hadia. I have a couple of questions from the audience. Zulekha Hussain says salam, and she says, thank you for your efforts in writing this book. My question is that in writing this book, did you consider Shia tafsir? I have been reading the study Quran and was struck by how rich the context is when informed by inclusivity. It would be amazing to see work, especially those that are putting women at the forefront, to be inclusive of other sects as well. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Zuleika, and thank you for asking that. I would have loved to engage with Shia Tafsir in this book. I will say I did look at Al-Tusi briefly when it comes to verse 4:3 on polygyny. The reason, however, is because what I was doing was a medieval and modern comparison, and I actually really confine my, I very much limit for methodological reasons, the number of exegetes with which I want to engage, because it's hard to, basically put them within their historical context and their intellectual context. If I'm looking at, let's say, a dozen, or even a dozen would have been too much for what I was trying to do in this work. And so for each of the chapters, I really focus on 4 to 5. They might not be the same 4 or 5, and I don't go beyond that. And because I'm looking at 4 Sunni modern commentators in the 20th century, Muhammad Abdo, Rashid Rida, Sayyid Qutb, and Muhammad al-Tahir ibn Ashur, I decided to deliberately kind of confine my comparison with also medieval Sunni commentaries. But like you said, I believe that, for future research, I would very much encourage a engagement with Shia tafsir as well, and different forms of tafsir. I absolutely agree with you. And I think in regards to Sunni Shia tafsir, specifically on verse 4:3, I found that there was a lot more in common. And I think it could be an important way to offset a lot of the unfortunate sectarian polemics we have in our community today. And so, going back and reviving the really healthy exchange that existed between Shia and Sunni scholars, I think would be one important way to do this.
It's really good to hear, Hadi. I mean, I had the same sort of thought. I was wondering why, one of the things that Western academia has done has not taken anyone seriously but male Sunni exegetes. So I had the same kind of question, and I'm happy to hear, and I'm sure so are the audience, that in your future work, you will consider Shia exegetes whenever appropriate. So another question from Abdul Majid Ben Habib is about adrabahunna. In the Quran, it is important to follow the Arabic root daraba. It appears that in the Quranic corpus, we can notice that the root mentioned appears in various ways. One of the most repeated variation is daraballahu misalan, and sometimes close to that, yadrabu Allahu al-misal, and other examples. Based on that, maybe it is important to study these various examples to understand the particularity of the Quranic use of adrabahunna, based on the comparison with other variations of the root daraba, as it appears within the Quranic text itself.
Thank you so much for that question. And I think that's an important issue that you raise, which is the semantic meaning. Like, what does wadribuhunna mean in this context? And perhaps it doesn't mean hitting at all. And that is one of the reasons why I, at the end, decided not to translate wadribuhunna at the beginning of chapter 5, and I just put wadribuhunna, did not translate it, to leave open the possibility that it actually is not referring to this semantic meaning at all and is referring to something else. So we have a few modern both scholars and translators of the Quran that have offered different semantic possibilities, one of whom is the late Professor Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman. God have mercy on his soul. He passed away, I think recently, maybe within the last year or so. And he was actually a distinguished scholar with IIIT. He actually, in his book, Marital Discourse, it's a small book, does a linguistic comparison of all the conjugates of darab in the Quran and says that perhaps it means to separate from, based on also the sunnah of the Prophet, the prophetic example in which he separated from his wives if there was ever an issue, specifically, most notably, the hadithat al-ifk, the incident in which Aisha was accused of adultery, and even while he was waiting for that to be resolved, there was just a separation from. So even for those who translate nushuz as sexual lewdness, even in that case, when there is a possibility that the wife is maybe having an affair, if we look to the prophetic example, there was no resort at all to anything remotely physical. He never hit a woman ever in his life, right? And we know that from the testimony of his wife, Aisha. In fact, he simply separated from them. And so I think that is, one compelling, argument out there among many others. Ahmad Ali, in his modern, I think it's called the contemporary translation of the Quran, actually sees the third step, وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ, as a reversal of the second step. And he sees it as, basically sleep with your wives based on a linguistic, again, one linguistic possibility from Lisan al-Arab.
Like fall upon her? Is that what he does? Fall upon
Sorry.
her? Does he use it as fall upon her? Or
Yes.
something?
Yeah, to sleep with her. And he says also, and then you have, of course, the late Laleh Bakhtiyar, also God have mercy on her soul, who I believe is the only, I take that back. I think she was one of the first female translators of the Quran into English. And she also opted in her translation of the Quran to translate وَضْرِبُوهُنَّ as to separate from or leave them. So I think it's important to talk about the different possibilities linguistically or semantically that this verb could have.
I think the next is more of a comment, and I think it's been responded to, but I'll just read it because it's here. Yasir Khan says, are you saying how people perceive their creator's attitude towards a gender through a text plays not a role in their behavior, so does not play a role in the behavior? What would be the purpose of emulating the prophetic character through the sunnah if that was the case?
Yeah.
I mean, I think this, anyways, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think our views of men and women and our views of gender hierarchy or the lack thereof very much informs the way we read and engage with the tradition, and very much informs the way we engage with both the Quran, the primary sources of the tradition, the Quran, and the prophetic tradition. I think if for medieval exegetes who clearly were living in hierarchical societies, which, by the way, gender hierarchies existed all over the world during that time period, and not just in the Muslim world, right? And so we see that reality, that socio-cultural reality, informing the way they understood certain aspects of especially gendered aspects of the Quran, in my opinion. So, when you have, for example, Ar-Razi discussing, why did God give men qiwama over women? And this development in exegesis, like Karen Bauer discusses in her book, Gender Hierarchy in the Quran, this kind of development that happens in the 6th Hijri century, 12th Gregorian century, of trying to examine, why? And sometimes leads to this subjective reasoning that then creates a space for this patriarchal, I think, reading of the Quran. And so when they talk about why did God prefer men over women, or why did God give men a degree, this is where you enter into very subjective spaces, in my opinion, and you find them providing interpretations that are very much reflective of their realities. So saying that the intellectuals are men, and the riders of horses are men, and the men are the warriors, etc., etc. And that, which is a reality that's not true in our present day. And so, yes, I do think that our views of gender influence the way we engage with the text. And I also will say that because of this, I think we as a community, collectively, have been sometimes at fault for amplifying and selectively engaging with texts that appear to give men privilege over women, and ignore so many texts that are sort of either just lost in the ashes of exegetical history or lost under the ashes of hadith commentaries. We've ignored texts that actually talk about male responsibilities towards women and female financial autonomy, female women's rights to have a dignified existence in their marriage, and so many others. And I think we have to ask ourselves why. And part of it is because of misogyny. That's the reason. It's misogyny. It's that, we've selectively engaged with texts that align with, for some scholars who happen to be male, with their vision of the world, and at the expense of other texts that we could be amplifying.
But my final question would be to sort of go off Zulekha's question, where she asks why you've not included Shia Mufassir. I wanted to ask, why have you not included female Mufassir? Could you say a little bit about that?
Yes, so I actually talk about this in the introduction of my chapter, and I talk about this is the book again, so it's actually at the very beginning of the introduction, and I talk about my choice of exegetes.
I do remember reading it. I mean, I just wanted the audience to know so that they know why it's not.
Yeah, it's actually, for those of you who have the book already, it's on the bottom of page 14, and it says, one may question why a book that analyzes modern shifts on women and gender issues in Quranic exegesis does not focus on the works of female exegetes. This design is not a function of choice, but of circumstance. And I talk about how that despite the plethora of female religious scholars throughout Islamic history and the plethora of female voices today, very critical female voices, some of whom I talk about in the book, Celine Ibrahim, Asma Lamberbat, Zainab Al-Alwani, Amina Wadood, Asma Barlas, among many others. Of course, Kisha Ali, Aisha Hidayatullah. So despite all of this, in this work, I'm methodologically interested in comparing medieval commentaries, actual tafsir, this kind of genre of Quranic commentaries, with the modern genre of Quranic commentaries. And in fact, this is what distinguishes this specific work from other works that have been written on this subject, such as Aisha Chowdhury's Domestic Violence and the Islamic Tradition, where when she enters the modern period, she moves away from Quranic commentaries, the genre, the literary genre of commentaries. In terms of the, when I talk about tafsir, so we have to distinguish between two meanings of tafsir, this notion of providing a commentary, right, which clearly could manifest itself in many media, in writing and audio and video, right? YouTube videos could be providing a tafsir. But I'm looking specifically at this literary genre of Quranic commentaries, of written text. And the reason I do this is because I believe it's important to look at this genre through the lens of intellectual and historical developments. How has the genre itself evolved? What are the methods that modern mufassirin are bringing forth that are different than the methods that medieval mufassirin were using? What are the relationships between methods and meaning? How is interpretive authority being constructed within this genre? And for this reason, I confine myself to these modern mufassirin in 20th century North Africa. I will say that despite the plethora of female religious scholars, we don't have an actual full tafsir except by one modern commentator. She's an Iranian Shia scholar, Nusrat Amin, who wrote the 15-volume Makhzan al-Arfan Dar al-Ulum al-Quran. And then, of course, we have a second modern mufassira, Aisha Abdurrahman, who wrote her work under the pseudonym Bint al-Shaltit. She also did not produce an entire commentary, but those are very important works. But for several methodological reasons, I just sort of had to confine myself to the ones I looked at.
Thank you so much, Hadia. And I wanted to thank you again from both the academic community and the Muslim community for being a public scholar and for your scholarship in general. Thank you so much for sharing your time with us. And thank you for the audience for being here. We look forward to your other works.
Thank you so much. And for those of you who have any feedback for me, I will put my email address in the chat. If I do a revision of this book in the future, I'm very much interested in hearing your feedback. Thank you all so much, and thank you for Triple IT